俺の財宝か？欲しけりゃくれてやる。探せ！この世のすべてをそこに置いてきた。
Yo guys, and welcome to this new video. This is the first of a series where I try to focus a little bit specifically on the Void Century, and in this one in particular I'm going to focus on the winged folks and the possible role they had, and this will bring us to make sometimes even surprising connections between them and other mysteries of the One Piece plot, like Joy Boy and the Celestial Dragons themselves. But before seeing all of that in detail, let me say I'm trying to publish a new video every day, so make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to immediately know when I upload something new. Alright, with that said, let's jump straight into it. So when talking about the Void Century, since we don't have and can't have in this moment any information coming directly from that period, the best starting point is focusing on what we know happened before the century even began. And one event we know happened 1100 years before the current timeline, and so 200 years before the beginning of the Void Century, was the foundation of Shandora by that population of winged people which, thanks to Ener's mini-series, we know came from the moon. And those very hieroglyphics of the fairy Vart will become our first source of hint about how the winged people lived before and during the Void Century, which, as we will see soon, was probably what influenced the most the world in that specific period. The first very important thing about those writings is how they distinguish three different kinds of winged people. Of course, they represent what we now call the Skypians, the Shandians and the Bilkans, and as you probably know, they differentiate in terms of appearance for the form of their wings, but this aspect in this situation is not as important as the fact that the Bilkan person actually seems to have wings not directly attached to his body. Indeed, it looks like there's something between them and his back. And since in One Piece every small detail is important, my opinion is that this element is connected with the fact the gods of Skypiea apparently don't have wings, which suggests that their detachment is a process done to establish leadership. And indeed, on the hieroglyphics, the Bilkan is the one clearly giving orders. And for this reason, since this population always associates a religious theme to its rulers, from this point on I'm going to call the members and the descendants of that ruling race the Priest class. For what concerns instead the other two, while the Skypian seems to have a simple military rule as leader of that army of robots, and for this reason I'm going to call that race the military class, the Shandian is clearly and surprisingly the scientist of the group, because he is the one building the army of robots. And this of course contrasts completely with what we saw in Nolan's story. Indeed, the inhabitants of Jaya, the Botanic Met, were a very primitive population which based their life on a reasonable gods and traditions. Which means that in the history of this scientific class, as I'm going to call from this point on the members and descendants of that race, something happened, most likely during the Void Century, which made them lose all their scientific knowledge. And this possibility becomes more likely if we consider it will create one of those contrasts so typical of One Piece. But for now, what we can say is that the Moon people had a technology more than 1000 years ahead that of the Blue Planet. And this looks much more incredible if we consider that the Moon probably didn't offer them too many resources to develop this technology. However, at the same time, the fact they created an army of robots, and these robots were also not so strong looking, probably means they were not so skilled and not so experienced in fighting themselves. But then, the fact they descended on the Blue Planet without that army they used all their scientific knowledge to build, it's incredibly strange, and in my opinion there is one only explanation for that. They realized that there was no need for a military action, and this is probably because, as we will see in a moment, in that specific era the One Piece world contained much more uninhabited lands, especially for what concerns the Grand Line. And this idea is supported by the fact that while Robin found records about the birth of Shandora, there is no information in the plot about a certain population that lived there before, which means the scientific class was probably the first one to colonize Jaya. By the way, the fact that the Skypians decided to remain on the clouds and the Shandians instead decided to descend on the surface suits with the fact these last were the scientific ones, were those who seek knowledge, information about a land they didn't know anything about, a planet providing much more resources than their homeland. And even if we know that members of the priest class remained on the clouds as well, considering how arrogance and greed seem to be their characteristic, most likely some of them descended on the surface as well, and near the end of the video you will see why I think they had the most important role among all the moon folks involved in the Void Century. In this situation we have to consider that some of them may have not have felt on Jaya, they could have reached other islands, and there is a high probability one of them was Wano. This is because most of the elements of the winged people itself probably were derived from one tale of Japanese culture, which is also the oldest prose narrative of Japanese history, called the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. In short, this tale talks about a poor man who waves bamboo for living, and one day he finds in one of them a tiny shining girl. She is adopted by the man and his wife and is called Kaguya. From that point on, the man starts to find gold each time he cuts a bamboo, and in this way he becomes very rich. So here we already have some correspondences with Wano, the bamboo and the gold. Indeed, we know that the country was once called the country of gold, but the important part is the next. Indeed, when the girl grows up, she becomes astonishingly beautiful, in particular because she emanates light. She naturally shines with the light of the moon, and here there could be the most important connection with Wano. Indeed, Kotsuki literally means light of the moon. Later on, this beauty makes the emperor himself fall in love with her, but she refuses him because she affirms they do not belong to the same land. Indeed, despite all the emperor's efforts to deny that, at the end of the tale, people come from the moon on clouds, so here is the reference with the moon people and Skypiea, to bring Kaguya, who was a princess on the moon, back on her homeland. And in this end of the story there are two very important elements. The first is that she gives the emperor, as a parting gift, the elixir of immortality. However, he doesn't want to live eternally without her, and so brings this elixir to the highest peak of Japan and burns it there. And surprisingly, because of the elixir, the flames never shut off from that point on, and that mountain was called for this reason Mount Fuji, a term originated from the word meaning immortality. That part of the story tries to explain why that volcanic mountain never stops burning, and considering that the name of that mountain is the only thing Oda maintained of Japan, of the true Japan in Wano, we can be sure that something about it will be related to that story. The second and even more important element is the fact that Kaguya herself didn't want to live, and this is because she loved her foster parent too much. However, the moon folks came to bring her back, gave her a winged robe which made her lose all the memories about her life on Earth. So we have wings and we have memory deletion, which is one of the most probable ways through which the founders of the world government could have erased an entire century from history. So, as you can see, there are already many ways in which this famous Japanese tale is connected to One Piece, and for this reason it's not so unlikely the involvement in the manga of a character correspondent to Kaguya, who could be related, as I mentioned before, to the birth of the Kotsuki clan. But it's very likely that Wano was not the only other island the winged folks visited when they descended on the surface, and even if it could be they didn't descend on them directly, considering that those who landed in Jaya were the scientific class and so a group of people probably incredibly interested in what this blue planet could offer in terms of knowledge, it's difficult to think they didn't start to explore the sea all around them. Waves that were most likely uninhabited, as I said before, because the technology of that era most likely couldn't allow people to travel in that very dangerous sea that was the Grand Line. However, as we saw before, the scientific class had that technology already at least at the current timeline level, and so it was probably not so difficult for them to adapt their knowledge to the new environment, maybe inventing some devices able to help them in the navigation, as for example the log post itself. And looking at things from this perspective, considering how Wano and Jaya were both strongly connected with the Ancient Kingdom, we could even assume that the Ancient Kingdom itself was actually composed by the many islands the winged folks visited during this adventure in the Grand Line, maybe even including lands from the north, south, east and west blue if their exploration went that far. And so in those 200 years between the Moon People's departure from their homeland and the beginning of the Void Century, my theory is that they created this enormous empire scattered a bit all over the world, characterized by the extreme wealth testified by Chandra's gold and by the fact that Wano itself was once called the country of gold, and an incredibly advanced technology born from the combination between their already advanced scientific knowledge they had on the moon and the resources they could find on the blue planet. But if so, how is it possible that this immense kingdom, so prosperous and so much more advanced than the rest of the world, was defeated in a war? It sounds very unlikely that a simple combination of 20 outside kingdoms could achieve such a feat, especially considering that all the races the world government uses and considers as potential slaves certainly didn't ally with the original 20 founders, which means they didn't have on their side the strength of the giants, the fishmen, the minks, the tontata and so on. For these reasons, it's very unlikely that the so powerful empire we have depicted up to this point was defeated by a simple alliance of 20 human kings. Instead, what becomes much more probable is that the enemy actually came from the inside. And with this, of course, I mean a civil war, a struggle within the Ancient Kingdom itself, which could explain not only how it was possible for the Ancient Kingdom to be defeated, but also how it was completely erased from history. Indeed, in this context, the victorious faction could both access the same technology of the losing one and knew the kingdom so well to make much easier its deletion. Of course, it's still possible, and actually it's very likely, that some human kingdoms allied with the winning faction, and indeed a very intriguing option is that all the 20 weapons we can find around the empty throne actually belonged to a true human king. However, what's missing there is the Ancient Kingdom, a part of that alliance who later founded the world government, which in this scenario was probably conveniently erased by the person who represents today that part of the Void Century War, a person as unknown to the world as powerful on it, him, the king of the world government. Another possibility is that some of those 20 kings were actually rulers of some islands belonging to the Ancient Kingdom itself, with him being one of them. In any case, if this idea of the war is correct, we should find inside the modern world government hints about its connection with the winged people. And going from the incredibly speculative to the incredibly solid, the first is the way they dress. Indeed, the style of their clothes is not that different from the one you can see in Skypiea, and what's more, the bubble they have on their head when they travel on the sea makes them look just like astronauts, which could very well be a One Piece style suggestion of their spatial origins. Second, still a bit speculative element is their hairstyle. Indeed, it's very similar to the one used by the god's militia, the warriors that are in charge to protect the god in Skypiea, and this connection is supported by the fact that this hairstyle seems to be a very ancient one, because even in Nolan's flashback, the god's militia of that time, so 400 years before the current timeline, had that same hair. But the element making this Tenryuubito winged people ancient kingdom connection truly solid is the Shabondi slave chart. Indeed, that paper, the same which before allowed us to exclude all the listed races from being allies of the world government during the Void Century, becomes an incredibly strong support to the theory of the winged people civil war in the Ancient Kingdom when we see that that specific species is not included. Considering that for its position next to the red line, Shabondi is certainly the most important center in the One Piece world for what concerns slavery, we can consider that slave chart the most accurate one existing. But while even the very species that Tenryuubito seem to belong to, the humans, are included, the winged folks are not. And since they are much easier to know about, you could say, than the Tontata or even the Minks, this is really strange. I mean, in this era there is also a very famous pirate, a member of the worst generation, Urog, who is winged. But even then, the slave chart completely ignores them, which, if seen from the perspective of the Void Century we are building in this video, can be easily explained with the head of the world government, so him and the Gorosei, not wanting to enslave their very ancestors, that population the world government was born from. But even if all of that suits pretty well actually, there's still a piece missing, which is the reason why the civil war happened in the first place. And this is where, as I anticipated at the beginning of the video, that group of moon people we call the prized class will acquire its true importance. Indeed, during the Skypiea arc, both Ener and his followers and the Bilkians who conquered Upper Yard 400 years before the current timeline demonstrated to be very arrogant and greedy people who thought they could do anything just because of their status, which is exactly the same thing the Celestial Dragons do today. And this is why I think it was the prized class who caused the civil war. The reason for that could be that during their explorations, of course, the winged folks arrived at some point to the red line, which, being a stupidly enormous amount of land, considering how much they valued the Earth in this blue planet, probably because their homeland, the Moon, is entirely composed by land, we can be sure the arrogant ruling class of that civilization started to seek that territory. However, as I will explain more in detail in the next video about Joy Boy, the D and the giant race itself, during the reverie we found many hints suggesting that that place was once inhabited by giants. And this is not simply because of the dimensions of the entrance to the Holy Land and of the Pangaea castle itself, but instead mainly because of the fact that the weapons all around the empty throne suggest that place was actually conquered, and the dimensions of the throne, which is much bigger than Im-sama's body, suggest that it was not done for a human king, which suits very well with the mysterious giant straw hat. And so what probably happened is that the discovery of the giant race is what caused that clash of beliefs inside the Ancient Kingdom itself, between those who wanted to conquer the Red Line and eventually achieved that result, the future world government, and those who instead defended the giant's side. And this alliance between the losing faction of the civil war and the giant race could be the very reason why some of them possess D, again as I will explore better in the next video. But the important part, which unfortunately we don't have enough elements to deduce now, is that that this losing side had its own specific goals, but without the possibility to achieve them because of the defeat, they passed this wheel to the next generations through the might of Raftel, of which I will try to pinpoint the location in the third video of this series, and consequently of the One Piece. So to recap, this theory talks about the ancient kingdom being founded by the winged folks who descended from the moon and explored the surface, visiting islands that because of the hostility of the Grand Line Sea were mostly uninhabited, creating in this way an enormous empire for both wealth and technology that, however, 200 years after the moon people arrived on the blue planet, was destroyed by a civil war between those who wanted to conquer the Red Line, which however was already inhabited by giants, and that, allying with the human kingdoms, in the end won and founded the world government against a faction that not only most likely sided the giants, but also had ideals somehow involving the ancient weapons that the victors decided to completely erase from history. So overall, in this video we treated the part of the theory that focuses more on the prelude to the main events of the Void Century and to the main characters of the Void Century. And as I said multiple times now, in the next video of this series I'm going to focus instead on Joy Boy, the person he was inspired by, and the way in which he connects Jaya and Wano, as well as the way he is strictly associated with D. So if you don't want to miss that next video and the future uploads of this channel, make sure to subscribe. For now, let me thank you for watching, don't forget to leave a like, and see you next time. Jane!